Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Sunday, September the 28th, 2025. I, in particular, have felt a rather lazy Sunday today, and it's been nice. It's been very nice. I got outside and was able to take a run, and then got outside and was able to do some reading. I need to do some cleaning today, but I have not yet gotten to that. But it's time for the poem, and we are at the penultimate poem in this series about Elizabeth Bishop from her collection Geography 3 from 1977. And kind of like the poem yesterday, this one's going to be a little bit difficult to comment on, but for a very different reason. And I will allow you to discern that reason as I go, and then I will make it explicit actually at the end of the poem. So without further ado, I'll just jump right in. This poem is called Objects and Apparitions for Joseph Cornell. Hexahedrons of wood and glass, scarcely bigger than a shoebox, with room in them for night and all its lights. Monuments to every monument, refuse of every moment, used, cages for infinity. Marbles, buttons, thimbles, dice, pens, stamps, and glass beads, tales of the time. Memory weaves, unweaves the echoes. In the four corners of the box, shadowless ladies play at hide and seek. Fire buried in the mirror, water sleeping in the gate. Solos of Jenny Cologne and Jenny Lind. One has to commit a painting, said Degas, the way one commits a crime. But you constructed boxes where things hurry away from their names. Slot machines of visions, condensation, flask for conversations. Hotel of crickets and constellations. Minimal, incoherent fragments, the opposite of history. Creator of ruins, out of your ruins you have made creations. Theater of the spirits, objects putting the laws of identity through hoops. Grand Hotel de la Couronne, in a vial. The three of clubs, and, very surprised, Thumbelina and gardens of reflection. A comb is a harp, strummed by the glance of a little girl born dumb. The reflector of the inner eye scatters the spectacle. God all alone, above an extinct world. The apparitions are manifest. Their bodies weigh less than light, lasting as long as this phrase lasts. Joseph Cornell, inside your boxes, my words become visible for a moment. Here's why this is difficult to comment on. The very last line of the poem, which is actually in italics, says, translated from the Spanish by Octavio Paz. From what I've read, Paz and Bishop were familiar with one another. They were friends or admirers of each other's work. And Paz came to think that this translation was actually better than his original. I've not read his original, nor am I fluent in Spanish, so it's difficult for me to comment on that. A couple things I will say is, the poem feels out of place, I think, in the collection, and I don't mean that as a critique. I mean that merely as it feels somewhat anomalous reading the rest of her work here, to drop a translation, the work initially of another poet, into a work of entirely new and original pieces. And yet, the very act of translation is one that draws our attention to poetic meaning and authorship. Another book I'm reading right now, called Cosmic Connections by Charles Taylor, tells us that all to speak is to translate. And what he's talking about there, as I understand it, is that all of our communications are not, they're phenomena, they're not the noumen. And in that sense, what I mean is they are things that we experience, not the things themselves, which is a certain deconstruction of communication that makes it difficult to feel as though any communication is actually successful, because it is, as T.S. Eliot told us with poetry, a thing that is understood before it communicates. And this poem in particular is precisely, I think, in a way that's very fitting for a poem that is translated. It's precisely about trying to interpret objects, art objects, and everyday objects. And so, in that way, it's also actually very fitting, I think, that Bishop would be interested in this poem, but also that she would translate it and place it within geography because, geography 3, because many of the things that we've talked about throughout this series have to do with her really stunning ability to look in detail and intimately at the specifics and the particulars of everyday objects and to cast them as new, to cast them from a different perspective or a different light. And this is, I think, contained, for example, within the second stanza: monuments to every moment, refuse of every moment used, cages for infinity. Cages for infinity as a way to look at art objects, I think, is a really wonderful phrasing, whether it's Paz's or Bishop's, because it hints at the way in which art, as we talked about previously, constantly calls us back. It calls us back to look again, and it calls us back, as poem does, the poem does, to consider the process of our own interpretation. And then a little bit later, after referring to this as tales of time, she also says, memory weaves, unweaves the echoes. And there's a nice kind of antithesis or symmetry within that line of memory weaves, unweaves the echoes, to make us think about memory as a way of drawing attention to, or even occasioning an echo of a vision or an echo of a significant moment that happened or occurred to us. And then we get this quote at, I think, the top of the sixth stanza. These stanzas are all, I think they're all tercets, except for the final couplet at the end. One has to commit a painting the way one commits a crime. And that's a very provocative statement that's provided in the middle of this poem from Degas that I'm going to need some more time, I think, to think about and to unpack, because the first things that come to mind are just the illicit and clandestine nature in which one would commit a crime. And how does one commit a painting in a similar way? I'm not a painter myself. I've seen some paintings. But to liken the act of doing that into a crime seems to suggest that it's going against certain societal laws, allowances, and expectations. And I think in some way that has to speak to the act of translation as well. To translate another person's poem and to drop it into your collection is, in a sense, to steal. It's an homage, but it's also claiming the basis of somebody else's work as not necessarily as one's own, because there's an attribution here, but to say that it's worth rendering again, and that in the rendering of it again a second time, you are reproducing it, but also creating something new out of it, which I think is at the heart of the experience of looking again at a particular work of art or a poem, and indeed to interpret it. I've often actually thought in doing these videos whether it wouldn't be more honest to just read the poem itself and to not offer any commentary at the end, because to try to communicate or interpret a poem is, in a sense, to immediately undermine and cheat it. And I think about this in regards to something Leonard Cohen once did on a radio show. At least this is apocryphal that I've read, that he read a poem on the air, and after he read it, the host said, okay, well, what's that mean? And he paused for a period of time, and then he read the entire poem again, which obviously is to say that poems cannot be distilled with an explanation to a particular meaning. They mean as themselves, they mean unto themselves. And I think that that's something that it populates the rest of the poem. Condensation flask for conversations, minimal incoherent fragments, theater of spirits. These very lines throughout the poem that are reflecting upon the apparitions and the objects, which is itself a attention grabbing and kind of provocative title, Objects and Apparitions, because it's placing together almost on the same level, but also making a distinction between the thing itself and what we see of the thing itself. Um, and the poem then begins to reflect on this near the end. It says, "The reflector of the inner eye scatters the spectacle." So once you've seen a thing and you begin to contemplate it, you are fracturing the actual thing itself. We all kind of own a work of art or a poem once we see it. We become co-authors in it and in its meaning. But also the viewing and the interpretation of the thing or the reading of the thing, in a sense, makes it less coherent, in a sense, splinters it. And so it says, "The apparitions are manifest, their bodies weigh less than light, lasting as long as this phrase lasts." So the light of the apparition, the thing that we see, is also something that's immediately gone, lasting as long as this phrase lasts. So a couple seconds, right? And it also draws attention to the descriptive language there and the inability of the descriptive language to capture the essence of the thing itself. So then we get finally Joseph Cornell, who I assume is the artist that the person is, that the speaker is viewing the work of. "Inside your boxes, my words became visible for a moment." And so my words, the things that I write, the things that I understand about your art object, are not just descriptions of them and reproductions of them, but your art occasioned that and created them for me. It allowed me to understand the thing that I thought before I actually thought it, um, which is, I think, a really cool way of thinking about our experience of art, that we have a aha shock moment before we're able to put language to it. And once we put language to it, we're in a sense kind of cheapening it. And that's what I've taken away from this poem in some. That's all I'll say today. Thank you for joining us again, and may peace be with you all on this lovely Sunday.